So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to introduce Stuart Dalziel. He is a Professor of Pediatrics and Emergency at the University of Auckland. He's also the Director of Emergency Research at Starship Hospital in Auckland, which I still think is maybe the best named hospital in the world. If anyone has a better one, maybe tweet it. So without any further ado, here's Stuart.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you very much for that, Sarah. So, as Sarah mentioned, I come from New Zealand, and we're particularly well known for our beautiful scenery. We're also very well known for our friendly locals, although we're not quite so friendly on the sporting field. And this is the All Blacks performing their traditional haka, which they do before every international game. And another Maori tradition is that when you introduce yourself, you introduce the mountain you're from and the body of water that you're associated with. So I'm from Auckland, or Tāmaki-makau-rau, and Auckland is built around 30 volcanoes. And this is the one that's closest to where I live. My house is just down in the foreground there in the valley, and it's known as Ohenirau. And out to the left is the city, and where Starship Hospital is, and then out in the distance is the Hauraki Gulf and Rangitoto. Rangitoto is our most recent volcano. It only exploded 600 years ago, which is slightly scary when you look at it every day as you drive into work. And what it means is it means bloody red night. And this is where I spend my bloody red nights, at Starship Hospital. So the emergency department's down on the left-hand side there, and the view, this is the back of the hospital, but the front of the hospital has a beautiful view for the patients over the Hauraki Gulf. What I wanted to do this morning was talk a little bit about global pediatric emergency medicine research, where we are, the power of networks to undertake the research that we're undertaking. Give you guys an idea of what networks are out there, and then finally some idea of where we all need to go with network research. So we've been doing multi-centre studies in paediatrics for many decades. And the reason that we do these is it gives us good generalisation by having many sites involved in the research. It gives us great power to look at rare outcomes. Things don't happen so commonly in paediatrics. But over the last decade or so, we've come together a lot more formally into research networks. And what this does is it stops us reinventing the wheel every time we undertake a new randomized controlled trial. It allows us to build capacity in researchers, to build capacity by bringing new sites on board, and to build capacity within the network itself, whether it be in methodology or whether it be in the research that's being undertaken. And there are a number of paediatric research networks out there internationally. The first ones that we had were based in the States, PEMCRC, which is associated with the American Academy of Pediatrics, and PERN. In Canada, they have PERC. There's going to be a lot of abbreviations in this. In Latin America and in South America, there's REDIPLA. Here in Europe, there's REPAM, which both involves the UK, Europe, but also Mediterranean and the Middle East. In Spain, 40 hospitals have come together for Rise Up Spurg, and Damien's going to talk about Peruki here in the UK and Ireland, and Meredith is going to talk about Predict in Australia and New Zealand. But what I wanted to do was give you an idea of some of the research that the other networks are undertaking. So PERN has been the most successful network in terms of the randomized controlled trials that they have taken. And this is their most recent study. It was a long-awaited study comparing fast fluid versus slow, cautious fluid in patients with DKA. So what the researchers did is they assigned a group of patients to be 5% dry, and they gave half the fluid over 24 hours, and another group they assigned to be 10% dry, and they gave half that fluid over 12 hours. So there's a big difference in both the amount of fluid and the speed that that fluid was given to those two patient groups. They enrolled 1,389 episodes of DKA. They found no difference in the primary outcome, which was decline in Glasgow Coma Scale, and they found no difference in any of the secondary outcomes as well, including a myriad of neuropsychological testing that they undertook. So this was really a myth that's been busted by pediatric emergency medicine. So PEMCRC, also in the US, is a lot more generalizable than PERN because they involve a large number of sites. And those sites tend to undertake a lot of prospective observational studies, the most recent of which has been in appendicitis and abdominal pain. In this paper, they compared ultrasound to CT to diagnose appendicitis. And it's no surprise to anyone outside of North America that ultrasound was actually better. But this is important because they needed this evidence to change their practice to what the rest of us are doing. What's also come out of this work is work that they've done on a prediction score for appendicitis. So this study was an observational study involving 2,300 patients in a rule that uses just history, exam, and a simple full blood count. And this shows the area under the curve for the rule. It's a lot better than the PAS or the Alvarado score that we were previously using. And the reason it has better statistics is what it does is it assigns a lot more patients into the low-risk group. So those are patients we can send home without any further treatment. So Redipla in South America and Central America have looked at what happens in that first golden hour of sepsis. How well are they doing in terms of following the international guidelines? Their results are no different to how we're doing. They're not doing as good as what we would all like to be and what we would like to achieve. But what they showed is they showed where the problems are. The problems are in early recognition. The problems are in early starting of peripheral inotropes. They now have, from this research, 2 topics they can focus on education in order to change practice for children that they care for. PERN in Canada, like PERN in the States, have done a large number of randomized controlled trials. And in this study of 886 children aged between 3 months and 48 months of age, who presented with gastroenteritis, they compared 5 days of probiotics with 5 days of placebo. They found no difference in the median duration or the median number of episodes of diarrhea, the median number of episodes of vomiting. Another myth busted by pediatric emergency medicine. REPAM here in Europe have done a prioritization study where they've gone out to their network and said, what are the priorities for our research that we need to be undertaking in the future? And what they found from asking their members and from asking people on the floor is that they needed to be undertaking research on risk stratification, practice variation, biomarkers in 4 key important areas: in sepsis, in fever management, in respiratory infections, and trauma. So this is going to plot out their research pipeline for the next 5 or 10 years by answering these questions. In Spain, they've done a lot of work in children who present febrile to the emergency department. And in this study of 182 children who were diagnosed with pleocytosis on their LP, so white cells in their CSF, they looked at their management and followed that prospectively. Patients who had a bacterial meningitis score of 0, who appeared relatively well clinically, and who had a low procalcitonin were actually discharged home. None of those patients represented with deterioration, and none of those patients actually had bacterial meningitis. So this gives us a really good data set to then kind of have management of these patients when we are all faced in the middle of winter bed block in our emergency departments. In 2009, the 5 networks that existed at the time realized that to answer some questions, they need more power than just their individual networks. And that if they're going to be truly global in the research, it requires more than regional research networks. And they came together in an umbrella network, which all networks now belong to, known as PERN. And PERN has some incredible numbers associated with it. There are 35 countries that are part of PERN. That represents 4 out of 6 WHO regions, over 200 hospitals with over 5 million patients presenting to their emergency department each year. And they've been able to answer a number of questions as well. And I wanted to highlight just a couple of these. So when PERN was established in 2009, the world was in the middle of the H1N1 or swine flu pandemic. And there were a lot of headlines around the world, and I particularly like this one from the Sun newspaper in the UK. But what PERN were able to do were to undertake a case control study to determine for all those thousands of patients who are coming in the door with influenza-like illness, which patients are actually going to go on and get severe outcome. And they found 6 risk factors on history and exam where you can kind of pull out the needle from the haystack. That's incredibly useful when you talk about a rare outcome like death from H1N1. In terms of the ability to have global answers to common problems, PERN's currently undertaking a study in community-acquired pneumonia, where they wish to derive and validate a prediction rule for management of these patients. It's going to involve over 5,000 patients from 100 hospitals around the world. So this will give us truly generalizable data to answer what is really an incredibly common problem and causes a lot of mortality and morbidity internationally. And so we're doing good stuff, but going into the future, there are some things that we need to do better. We need to include all. When you look at this map, there are a number of massive gaps, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. The risk of death is 15 times that for the green hospitals in sub-Saharan Africa. We need to be including these children in our research network. The most populous part of the world is Asia, and we need to include networks within Asia as well if we're going to answer those problems. For us in the green, what we need to be doing is in our networks, we need to be including all hospitals. So the vast majority of the hospitals which are part of these networks are actually tertiary children hospitals. Yet, children don't present to these hospitals in all our countries. More than half of the population are actually treated in community hospitals, secondary hospitals, DGHs. Call them what you like. That's where children are seen, and we need to be involving those hospitals in our research if we're going to answer the questions for the patients that we see every day. And once we get that answer, that's not good enough. That's only half of what we need to do. We actually need to go out and we need to change practice. And this is an incredibly important journey for us to go on. 40% of patients actually fail to receive treatment for which there is clear evidence that that treatment will give them benefit. 20 to 25% of patients actually receive treatment which there's really good evidence to say it doesn't work, or even worse, really good evidence to say it actually causes harm. And we're not immune to this in paediatric emergency medicine. So this is a study in over 30 hospitals in 10 countries looking at management of bronchiolitis. And what this study found is that 30% of the patients who came into our emergency departments received pharmacotherapy for their bronchiolitis where there is clear evidence that that makes no difference whatsoever. And bronchiolitis is the most common reason to be admitted into hospital in the developed world. So for our most common condition, for the last decade, all our guidelines have said, don't treat it, yet we still can't get it right. And it takes a while to get things right. The Institute of Medicine suggests that it takes, on average, 17 years. Think about it. 17 years from new knowledge to actually getting that knowledge into practice. And you think, well, that doesn't happen in paediatric emergency medicine. That doesn't happen in emergency medicine. We're great. We're new adopters. We do things fast. We work really quick. We work really slick. This has been the biggest study that's probably come out of our field in the last decade, the FEAST study. And what it did is it compared three groups who presented with sepsis. They either got no fluid boluses, saline boluses, or albumin boluses. And it was stopped early. As we all know, there was this mortality difference where you had less mortality if you were in the no bolus group. So what did we do? Well, we talked about it a little bit. And this is what we said. Well, we need to be a little bit cautious about that. There were lots of kids. It was done in sub-Saharan Africa. There's high rates of malaria. There's high rates of malnutrition. There's high rates of anemia. But if you look at the data, if you look at the study, if you look at the subgroup analysis, there is no difference in those who had malaria or not malaria. There is no difference in those who had anemia or not anemia. Yet we would rather follow studies like this, done in 1991, a retrospective observational study. So rather than looking at a randomized controlled trial of over 3,000 children with robust design, we'd rather follow a study with 34 children. So despite all of this, I actually think we're in a really good place. We are producing really good research. We're producing research that actually matters for our children that we see every day in our departments. And we've been able to do this with cooperation. We've been able to do this with really good cooperation between the hospitals and the networks, and internationally, between countries and between networks as well. But going forward, we must include all countries, we must include all hospitals, and in doing so we need to ask the right questions. And once we get the data from those questions, we really need to change our clinical practice. And as William Osler suggests, that journey is going to be bumpy, but I think it's worth it.
you want to stay standing? Wow, that was an incredible journey through emergency research, including the challenges, but also an update on, I lost count of how many papers we just got a nice summary on. So thank you. I forgot to say at the start that you should tweet questions as we go, but we'll also take questions from the floor, so put your hand up. And I think we have a roving mic available. Tessa's in the middle. While we're waiting, I've got a question.
Yep.
So 17 years from a research project being done to translation of research, do you think that's going to change in this day and age of social media and internet?
I think it can change for some things. I think it can change for, we're really good at adopting new therapies. We're really good if something comes out where it works and it's a new drug or a new treatment of adopting that. And I think that's moved, particularly with social media and things like that. We're atrocious at actually turning things off. Or if we've got two choices where one group uses half and another group uses half, of actually choosing the right thing. So social media hasn't been able to change that as fast as what we would like it to do. And I think that's a challenge for us all, and a challenge for people like Don't Forget the Bubbles as well, in order to try and improve those things.
Yeah, fantastic. Edward, I think you've got some questions from Twitter.
Yeah, so Thomas Fowles wants to know, what do you think has to happen to translate the evidence you're talking about in fluid resuscitation into practice? How does that end up being applied?
Well, I think what we needed to do is we needed to do a randomized controlled trial in our population. I think some of that, I was trying to be a little bit provocative with what I was saying, but some of those things about it being a different population hold true. But what we should have done is, it's been 8 years since that was published. We should have actually, I should be standing up here and saying, this is the results of the randomized controlled trial that's looked at that in the population that we all see. But I'm not. And what makes me feel a little bit upset as well, because I'm part of the people who's doing this work, is that we don't even actually have that trial being planned currently either. And partly that's because we don't yet have equipoise. In order to do that, we need to have equipoise, and we actually don't have that within our colleagues and amongst ourselves in terms of what we're going to do. So I think we need to be quite quick in terms of kind of reading things, thinking about it critically, making up our mind, realising that there's equipoise, and then acting on it.
Okay. Any more questions from the crowd? All right, we might thank you, Stuart, again.